Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Venerable Akincana. I am a disciple of Ajahn Brahm. I live at Bodhinyana Monastery. Welcome to this book club. It's the first one I've done, although I have attended a book club that Ajahn Brahmali had done maybe a couple of months ago, actually. So I have a sense of the style, but I will open up for discussion pretty much all the time. So if anybody wants to say something or comment as we go through, please feel free. I stick up your hand, or I don't know what is the normal process. Just put up your hand and we can. Thank you, Eddie. That's very kind of you. And please forgive me. I've got a little bit of a cold, so if I stop to blow my nose or clear my throat every so often, excuse me. Okay, so I chose this book partly because Ajahn Brahm, somebody had given this book to Ajahn Brahm, and he actually recommended we put it into our monastery library. And our monastery library, it's really hard to get books into it because it's full. So it intrigued me, and Ajahn Sangharatna had said he started reading it and he thought it was also very good. So that intrigued me as well, and so I got a copy, and then I started reading through it, and I thought, oh, yeah, it's a very interesting book. It was originally, I think it was printed in 2019, so just prior to COVID, so it's reasonably recent, and it's written by a neuropsychologist, which I had to kind of look up, because this is all terrain that was very unfamiliar for me. It's nothing to do with my background. And so a neuropsychologist, some of you may already know, is somebody who looks at kind of our behaviors, emotions, so the psychological aspects of a human being, but in the context of the anatomy of the brain. And so if you have read the book, you probably already see that it's structured around the anatomy of the brain, and he describes a lot of where I suppose neurologists and neuropsychologists have discovered the seats. He uses the word seat, actually, the seat of certain functionality in the brain. And so where these things are happening, and some of these discoveries were made in the 60s, which are really interesting, but they're still not considered probably mainstream in psychology. As he says, actually, most psychologists, most psychiatrists do not really accept or consider these as these propositions or hypotheses that he's proposing in the book as valid, or they don't take it into account. I don't think that they disagree with it as such. They say, yes, those things are correct, but they don't actually incorporate it in the way that they approach their profession or their treatment of patients. And he says it's partly because it's such a challenging idea, the idea that we don't have a self. So the book basically then goes into a series of chapters where he describes, using the left brain, right brain split of the anatomy, the broad split. He kind of goes into some of the history of how certain discoveries were made, which I'll talk a little bit about, and how they relate to Buddhist, Taoist, and even Advaita Vedanta philosophy. So he's quite broad. Dr. Niebauer is a Zen teacher as well as a neuropsychologist. So he teaches both. He teaches both neuropsychology and Zen meditation, which is probably where the idea or the kind of a drive for this kind of book came up, which makes it very interesting. And the book seems to me, it's actually quite did anybody read it? I'm not sure if any hands up of people who read the book. Maybe, well, you don't have to declare yourself. But maybe you'll read it after the session, or maybe not. But I think it's aimed at sort of an educated American reader. He's an American lecturer. Some of the language and the style. So it's actually relatively easy to read. It's not a very dense kind of scientific book that's seeking to prove things. And the structure of the book is interesting because after some of the chapters, he has actually like a workbook where he encourages you to try certain types of kind of mental experiments, I would call them, or practices, almost in a Buddhist way, to see if you can understand what he's trying to get you to see. These are probably, if you meditate, they're not particularly complex. So again, I think it comes back to my point that the book is aimed at people who know virtually nothing about Buddhism or Eastern philosophy, and therefore if you have meditated or you have some contact with Buddhism in the past, like everybody here, then those things would be probably a little bit simplistic but interesting, because he's trying to connect them up with the point of the chapter, or the point he's trying to make. And I suppose one of the interesting things is, for example, he's trying to give you an idea of how the right brain is the seat of spatial awareness in most human beings. And he then tries to get you to do a kind of a practice where you actually see the space rather than see the object. So, for example, it's very interesting, actually. I think I've heard other people try that. So in this room, when we are asked generally as adult human beings to think about this room and look at what's here, we will look at all the things in it, right? The people, the chairs, the fans, the lights, or whatever, the stage that you can see behind me. We will look for the things. But he actually says the dominant thing in this room is space. So he says it's interesting that actually we don't see the thing that's mainly here. It's empty space, right? There's tons of it in this room. There's much more space than there are things in this room. And he says it's an interesting thing because it's already showing you that our minds are dominated by a particular way of seeing things. And I suppose I'll kind of wind back to the front of the book, where he tries to start talking about how the neuropsychologists understanding this, because they're saying, wow, okay, your mind, most minds work in a way that distorts reality quite a lot, or they focus only on bits of reality and leave out all the rest. So he's already showing you that, and this is a fundamental tenet of Buddhism. Ajahn Brahm talks about it quite a lot in some of his talks. He talks about vipalasas, distortions in our perception, and how recently he gave a couple of talks at the monastery where he was also talking about how even stream enterers still have a lot of vipalasa, a lot of distortion, despite making that breakthrough into having a glimpse of nibbana or having a very strong understanding of non-self. They still are dominated by these distortions of perception. So let's look a little bit at how Dr. Niebauer talks about this, how he kind of shows us how science, or neuropsychology, neurology and psychology are beginning to understand this. So I might stop there first and say, are there any questions or comments at this stage? Or shall I keep going? Eddie? Okay, let's crack on then. So he starts off by talking about a study that was done in the 60s by a doctor called Gazzaniga in the US, I believe. And I mean, this is an amazing thing to me. I never realized it. But basically, there were patients suffering from severe epilepsy. And so this doctor, along with somebody else, and I think the other doctor got a Nobel Prize for this work in the 80s, but they came to the conclusion that to stop this severe epileptic attacks, that they would separate the left and the right brain, and there's 7,000 billion connections between the left brain and the right brain. And so these two doctors basically said, we'll try it out. I can't imagine the person who would actually agree to that and say, but maybe, I guess they were so desperate, poor things, that they felt this might be a solution, and this was very experimental in the 60s. So they severed the connection between the left brain and the right brain. And the sides of the brain are cross-wired, so the right brain sees through the right eye, and the right brain sees through the left eye, and the left brain sees through the right eye. So it actually worked amazingly. So it did actually stop or reduce the severity of these epileptic seizures that these patients were having. But more interesting for us, or for this book, is subsequent to going through these procedures, they started kind of doing tests with them to see how they were affected by this change, right? By the way that their brains were separated. And this is kind of the central point of the book, that they found that so they started discovering how the left brain works, because it wasn't connected to the right brain. They could show things to the right eye on cards, basically. They'd give them information or instructions to the right eye only, probably cover the left eye, and see how those people would respond. And what happened was they discovered that in the left brain, they would show them things, and that the left brain had this remarkable ability to create and understand patterns, to kind of bring together put together categories, patterns, but it would do something also that was very strange. It would make things up very liberally. It would just make things up, and so many of these patterns, answers that the left brain would give itself or give the person, were actually incorrect and completely untrue. For example, there's one case where they and this happened again and again and again. So they started saying, well, this is very odd, because your left brain was getting this information, and then when they asked that person, well, why did you do this, or how did you think about this, they would create this complicated answer that had nothing to do with what actually happened. But it sort of did. It would put together these pieces, but it was incorrect. It was not true. As an example, they had one lady in a van where they were doing the tests, and they gave her a card to communicate with her left brain, and it just said walk. And so she read it, and then she got up, walked out of the van where they were doing the tests, and walked off, and then came back. And so then when she did that, they asked her, oh, why did you just leave? Right? They gave her another card and said, why did you just leave? And she said, oh, I was thirsty, so I went outside to get a Coke. So she had justified what had happened, and the mind had just made up this story, and it's quite a complicated story, but in actual fact, they said, no, you went outside because you were following the instruction or the prompt from this thing. And they found this happened again and again and again, consistently. So the left brain, or he calls it the interpretive side of the brain, would actually just kind of create a plausible story that, it sort of makes sense, right? Oh, yeah, okay. But it would do it sort of in response to things, because it probably couldn't really recollect or understand the simplicity of that initial command, right? It would have to make a whole story about why it was motivated to do this, why it was doing things. And they find this left brain activity is very consistent. It happens. And the left brain as well is the language center. They found this through other things where over time they had somebody who was had damage to their left brain, and that impacted their speech center, etc. So through the course of time, as these things have arisen, they've understood, okay, these functionalities, the way that the left brain operates is very interesting, and it has a tendency to sort of deceive us, actually, which is really interesting. I mean, from a Buddhist context, this sort of vipallasa, this distortion in understanding is there. The Buddha doesn't really talk about where it comes from and talk about an anatomical kind of location. But he says to us actually that this is a dominant characteristic of the five khandhas, right? That they are grasping and that they're constantly, almost with every kind of action, thought, there's a self that arises with this process, right? And so I guess this is the interesting thing, is that he said the neurologists have been looking, I'll come to the right brain in a second, the neurologists have been looking for, okay, where is the sense of self, right? So they found other processes, like, you know, which part of the brain recognizes patterns, which part of the brain deals with speech and talking and sequential reasoning and interpretive activities of things, but they haven't found the seat of the self in the brain at all. Right? So there's still like a lot of talk. So he comes up with the hypothesis that the left brain, because it's constantly creating views, beliefs, judgments, this is and speaking. It's you know, when anybody who tries to meditate, you know, when you're talking, it's doing all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And it's bringing up more stuff as memories kind of load in. It proliferates, and this apparently is mostly coming from the left brain. And he says that that talking and that separation, because of course we're experiencing that separate to everybody else, that is where the sense of self is arising. So he feels that it's in the left brain. That's his hypothesis, that there's not really a seat for it, but it's a kind of a delusional process that happens that is quite important actually for human beings in a way, because that's the interpretive pattern-making process. But what really interested me was that it's actually a lot like the way AIs function. You know that there is now a kind of consideration, like if you talk about ChatGPT when it was coming out and how it would falsify things, right? But it would create these really interesting and plausible explanations, but based on information that was just out there in the web, so that it was available to it. But it's like the left brain is our own internal ChatGPT. It actually functions this is prior to some of the more recent AI, but it's like our left brain functions like a generative AI process without the controls, right? So it doesn't really, and so then he talks a little bit about people who probably have very low emotional intelligence, is that your ChatGPT program is going a bit crazy. You know, it starts giving you all kinds of stuff about why things are happening. And again, he also talks a little bit about schizophrenia, and he says it's likely that it more sits in the left brain because it's creating delusions around about what's happening, why things are happening in the world. And I think he says since the 50s it's been treated with dopamine. And so dopamine is basically a chemical, a substance that dominates left brain activity. And so that's actually how they actually treat schizophrenia, even until now. And so they recognize that it's this ChatGPT in your left brain that's just unrestrained, uncontrolled, that's creating theories and fantasies and delusions that actually is the driver of extreme kind of psychosis. I thought that was quite interesting as well. So let's leave the left. Are there any comments or questions? Yes, yeah?
From what you're saying, it sounds like the left brain wants to create storylines out of things and attempt to understand reality.
That's correct, yeah. Yes, so that's right. So it's getting all this input, you know, the mind is making, the left brain, that part of the mind is making contact through the senses, through memories, so mental phenomenon. and it's getting all this input in terms of activities around it, people talking, talking to you. And what he says is that the left brain is possibly the most sophisticated pattern making and categorizing kind of systems in the universe, right? Even at this time in 2019, he was saying that AI doesn't even come close, and that there's nothing that comes close to how sophisticated that brain is and how quickly. For example, one of the things he says is when you're reading, which is just kind of squiggles and dots and dashes on a page, right? But the speed at which we kind of put that together, understand it, bring it into our brain, create images from that, and understand the actual information, those are all patterns. Those are all kind of a pattern and groupings, sequential logic. Sequential logic is also one of the things that the left brain does very well. And it dominates the whole reading function. So yes, that's exactly right. But it doesn't have an ability to really validate this unless you're very careful with that. So it probably, in my mind, explains some of the issues we have in the world today, where there's sort of unrestrained access to information, lots of it on the internet, but the tools or the skill in kind of filtering it, deciding what is likely to be correct. Exactly right. And so it's an extremely important function, but the left brain on its own doesn't really control it so well. And so as you saw with the thing about the lady who stepped out of the van and went out and came back, and she just immediately gave a story that was very plausible but was untrue, right? And in many tests, when the left brain is left on its own to decide what's happening, it doesn't really come up with a correct interpretation. They're plausible, but they're not very correct. And so it's also where judgments and beliefs are. And I don't know about you, but I have judged things wrongly so many times I've lost count of how wrong I've been, how often in my life about many things. Beliefs, judgments, since you're a child, right? You're making, all these things are happening, and that you're kind of assuming things. He gives one example where I think a patient or person he knew had a lot of anxiety. She had a tendency towards anxiety, so there'd be these underlying tendencies already that would incline your mind to think in a particular way, your left brain in this case. And she had decided that her colleagues really hated her and became very paranoid because they were sort of in a corner whispering and looking at her. And she got really paranoid and was very upset about it. I had a few days of that. And then it turned out that they were planning a surprise birthday party for her, right? And so it's a classic case of where your mind can go, how your mind is interpreting this. And it depends probably on the character of the person too. That some people do have a greater underlying tendency towards anxiety, to pessimism, to a negativity. Ajahn Brahm talks a lot about, the fault-finding mind, seeing fault or in ourselves, etc. So where these underlying tendencies come from, though, is not something that's covered in the book, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So there are things that I thought are missing, from a Buddhist perspective. Does that answer the question? Yeah. So he then kind of goes on to the right brain, and the right brain understanding in neurology and neuropsychology dates from an event in 1996, so it's not that long ago. Basically, a neurologist, I think, or neuroanatomist. I'm not so familiar with all the differences between these kind of scientific paths, but this lady called Jill Bolt Taylor, my memory is correct, in 1996 had a stroke. this is actually one of the nice things about the book. He kind of throws a story at you at the start of a chapter, and then he says, well, this had a kind of a seismic impact on the science, on neurology, right? It was a huge discovery. And so basically they weren't that sure about the right brain's function or all of the, how it operated. They had some idea of it from the split brain testing about, how it has more spatial awareness, etc. How it can understand language, but it doesn't drive speech, for example, things like that. So it can still kind of understand speech and communication. But in 1996, Jill Bolt-Taylor had a stroke, and she was also, I think, a neuroanatomist, or something like that. So it was kind of fortunate and unfortunate at the same time. She recovered eventually. She had to go through years of, treatment and therapy to recover the kind of power and activity of her left brain. But the stroke was primarily it was entirely in her left brain, and it closed it off. It shut it down, her left brain. And so she was left basically with just the right brain activity. And years later, she was able to, once she kind of recovered, she was able to describe her experiences in a very scientific, and in a very scientific manner. And actually, her book is actually in the Bodhinyana library as well. I haven't read it yet, but it sounds very interesting. Yeah. Yes, I think it is. Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Have you read it? You haven't read it? That's her book, yeah. So what she said was that she lost the kind of, some of the analytical left brain activity, the interpretive pattern-making functions of her brain for some years, but instead she found herself in a place of space, gratitude, happiness, contentment, all these very wonderful qualities, right? And so she believes that it was like almost maybe an experience, a nibbanic experience, right? That was her understanding, although I don't think she's a Buddhist or anything like that, but she said it was such bliss to just experience the right brain and have the left brain cut off. I thought about that and I wondered, okay, well maybe that's all you have to do, right, to get enlightened. That would be good, wouldn't it? I don't think it's so easy somehow, I think, and I'll come to this point about the mind, and the brain in some of my own thoughts about this. But it did strike me, wow, okay, that would be amazing, if all you have to do is you could go and have an operation or a machine could do this to you, and all of a sudden you could be just really happy. She said it was incredibly blissful. She called it La La Land because from a scientific perspective, she felt she had lost all the kind of the speech, the kind of analytical parts of her mind, but she was just incredibly happy as a result of the stroke, which is actually quite a remarkable thing, isn't it, of itself? I think there's a wonderful story by an Italian writer called Primo Levi. I don't know if any of you have ever read him, but he was he was in the concentration camps. He was Jewish, Italian, and then after the war he went back to Italy and he became a writer and he wrote the story. And he writes a story about a small village in the mountains where this kind of virus or illness kind of comes and starts infecting everybody, and they get these fevers, and then there's this incredible pain in their back, and then they get these lumps on their back, and it's incredibly painful and very disturbing. But then out of these lumps grow these two huge white wings. And some of the people, it's just like a wonderful thing for them because they can fly, right? The wings actually, they're huge. They become metaphorically angels or physically angels, and then they can fly. And so there are some of the people who are infected by this disease who think it's a miracle, who think that this is so wonderful. They can fly as human beings, and they kind of start thinking, is it like something from, a gift from God, right? But others are so kind of tormented by it that they have the wings amputated, it's a beautiful story actually. He kind of shows you how our reactions depend on our minds and our hearts, and how something can be seen as a great gift and something can be seen as a disaster, a torment. Anyway, that's Primo Levi. He's a beautiful writer actually, wonderful short story. Anyway, so she got this gift, which has also been a gift in some sense to the field of neuropsychology, because through that they discovered many of the attributes of the right brain. And the way he describes it is, he says it seems now, since that time and further studies, that what the right brain is doing is it doesn't really interpret, it just understands, it makes meaning, not sort of an analytical meaning, not a thought-out meaning, but it's an understanding of things, and it's a very profound consciousness. It's kind of the consciousness and understanding and meaning that needs to balance the left brain. So that's how the left brain is restrained in what he says, is through that kind of grounded understanding of the right brain. It has the right brain has a spatial awareness, so the right brain would see the space, not just all the people in this room, right? It would also notice things like that, which I think I kind of saw it a little bit as related to the immeasurable, the immeasurable meditations, the Brahma Viharas. The right brain, he actually talks about the meditative experience and mindfulness being more in the right brain rather than the left brain, and the spaciousness that the right brain can grasp, the sense of space and openness. The right brain is also where it sort of puts things together. It's where poetry, for example, and metaphor and similes are understood. So, he says the left brain, and this they know, is that when people have had injuries to the right brain, it's like they can't understand poetry. They find anything that has this complicated, metaphorical or simile-based idea and concept, people who don't have a right brain functionality find that very difficult. They actually struggle with it, whereas the right brain is where you can put an image together with an idea quite easily, right? And so you can start to see that, okay, this is how the right brain is balancing. But it's not balancing it like, oh no, it's not telling the left brain, no, what you're thinking is stupid. It's kind of grounding it, and it's kind of giving it has more wisdom. And that's actually what he proposes. He says the right brain possibly is the seat of our wisdom. Or where wisdom can arise. At least that's where it's represented anyway. So he talks a bit about what are right brain functions, where right brain activity dominates. And I think part of this is that they can see it, and they do MRIs and stuff, so that they actually test this out. Yoga, meditation, Qigong. So, and he says it's interesting that where these are things where you're actually doing, you're not getting involved, you're kind of watching there's a flow, you're doing things, but your kind of consciousness that you're using is very different from that interpretive pattern-making consciousness that is what the left brain is doing all the time. And he says the left brain will try and tell you things about what the right brain may be doing things, but it'll say, oh yeah, that's right. The left brain will kind of intervene and keep trying to tell you, yeah, I'm the one doing this, I'm the one who knows, right? And he says it's actually become an aspect of psychology and neuropsychology that in the field, the specialists actually say that they don't think right brain consciousness is consciousness, right? The consciousness that you may have when you're doing yoga and you can sense the flow, or the consciousness that you have when you attain to some stillness, when you're meditating, right? Where there's no more speech, at least for a while, but you're completely aware. So that consciousness, interestingly enough, certainly in the Western kind of stream of psychology, is not considered consciousness. They're kind of saying, oh, it's unconsciousness, subconsciousness, it's something else, right? So they only apply consciousness to interpretive activity of the left brain, which I thought, oh yeah, that's right, actually, it's very interesting, isn't it? But he says that's definitely consciousness, right? What the right brain is experiencing, what the stillness you are experiencing at times in meditation is a very profound and deep consciousness. It's a awareness, and it's where meaning and understanding happen from a Buddhist perspective. Perhaps this is what the Buddha says, is that that's almost like when you're going into perhaps deep samadhi or jhana, where you have that opportunity to see non-self, right? That's where the Buddha says the understanding or the vision and knowledge, jnanata passatta, of non-self arises through the samadhi process, right? And it's this consciousness that has that understanding. This is the right brain, or the consciousness that where it comes up. And that's why perhaps, he doesn't say this in the book, but perhaps, or not directly, but perhaps that's why what you're doing in meditation is quietening the left brain. You're really letting it settle down, slow down and stop, and perhaps that's why it's easier if your left brain is not so active, right? That your right brain. That's why yoga, meditation, those things are quite helpful. Being in nature and not thinking about it. I know that in my experience, some of my meditation teachers. My first retreat was many years ago. Was terrible. It was a good retreat, but it was a very difficult one for me. Because of course I came in and I thought, that's it, I'm a smart person, I can just meditate, I'll figure this out. And it was, the first few days I just had these tension headaches the whole time because I was forcing myself, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to sit through this, I'm going to do this. And I went to see the nun who was doing the interviews, and she looked at me, and she asked, actually it was really good, she just asked me to sit down, she looked at me for a while, could see the tension in my shoulders and neck, and could see that I was like, my brow was furrowed. And she said, you got a lot of tension. I said, yes, what's going on? And she said, okay, stop meditating. Just stop for tomorrow, stop, or the rest of this afternoon, stop. She says, go outside and do nothing. Try and do nothing. Just sit there and sense the breeze, watch the trees moving, watch the grass, watch the sun move its position in the sky. And she says, just do that. That's it. I don't want you to do anything else. And of course it worked, right? because it just grounded me and opened my mind. And I guess what I was doing, what she was showing me was connect with your right brain, And then she said, when that happens, come into your heart. She says, you really have to feel your heart. Stop, all the stuff up here. Give that away and come down into you. And I have used that practice of, trying to come to the heart, as Ajahn Brahm says, to really come to a sense of it and try and locate it there. And she said, the heart has vibrations that are far more powerful than your brain, and your brain is very skittish, right? Maybe it's the left brain, it's jumping around, whereas if you harmonize it with your heart, coordinate it, so you eventually have to bring them and create some harmony between what's happening apparently in your brain and your heart, and the heart will really stabilize it and ground it and help you a lot to actually find peace, right? Perhaps that's a way of connecting with the right brain. Anyway, it was a wonderful teaching, and it's just a bit simple. It's a bit like Ajahn Brahm's, finding that kindness, bringing that love into your meditation, so that you can, I think, ground your meditation practice and find your way into stillness, right? Quieten the mind. So, yeah. Good question. Okay, so this is the very good question, because as I was reading this book, right, so the Buddha actually never talks about the brain. That the 31 versus 32 parts of the body, you've heard this, possibly Ajahn Brahm may have told you, but originally in the body contemplation, there are only 31 parts that the Buddha actually lists. The commentaries have added another part. What part do you think that is? That's right. So the Buddha never talked about the brain, which is really interesting, actually. If he lists all these parts, he must have had some idea. It would be really strange, but perhaps there's a reason. I was pondering this while I was reading this book. Why didn't the Buddha list the brain as one of the 30 one parts of the body that you use. I mean, the body contemplation is an asubha contemplation, so it's there to allow you to have a sense of the body. Perhaps he had a reason for leaving out the brain. I think, and in the book also kind of goes into this, I think this is obviously the limits of, the limitations of kind of trying to understand a human being through anatomy, right? So you cut out pieces and then realize, okay, that thing doesn't work anymore, so that means that this is where this happens. But you're making also already an extrapolation or a generalization to all humanity. So he talks about a scientist called Rupert Sheldrake. Somebody may have heard. Ajahn Brahmali had told me about Rupert Sheldrake, and I'm now very interested to read his book. I'm trying to find one of his books. He came up with the idea some time ago, I think in the 90s, of a thing called morphic resonance. But Rupert Sheldrake has proposed, and I think this is kind of in line with Buddhism as well and Taoism, that our consciousness is a morphic kind of field, like a magnetic field, right? It's around us, it's sort of here, but it's not in our brain. It's not just in our brain. The brain is connected to it, so is our heart, so is our stomach actually, so are our lungs, so is our skin, etc., our consciousness. So we have, in Buddhism, we have 6 types of consciousness, the 5 senses and the mind, right? The consciousness of what? Correct, yeah. And so what he's saying is that consciousness, so these neurologists have not found the seat of consciousness in the brain. They still haven't, they don't know where it is, but they have said, no, it must be in the brain. It must be somewhere there, right? Because they're materialists fundamentally. So they're saying it can't be in the stomach, surely, you know. Although some people might say it could be, why not? Or in the heart, more likely, perhaps. I mean, perhaps in Buddhism, that's why we talk about mind and heart, you know. I potentially feel that it's more here, you know, the spiritual heart, maybe not. But of course, then the issue of, when they do a transplant, you know, how come you still have the same mind, more or less, right? So, but the idea of a morphic sort of field as your consciousness and your mind is that your consciousness is more the creator of this existence, right? It comes, and in fact, it's kind of what they say in the suttas, that consciousness and the other 4 aggregates, they hold each other up, right? They support each other. Consciousness is also driven by or conditioned by volitional formations or will, right? So those things are there. But the Buddha talks about consciousness coming into the womb, and then the connection of that consciousness with the embryo will actually cause a human being to arise. Yes, yeah, rebirth consciousness. So from a Western scientific perspective, they're kind of a bit stumped here, but Dr. Niebauer believes that in that consciousness is a field, and that the brain, he kind of thinks that the brain is the mind, but this is where I disagree. I don't think the brain is the mind. I think there are functions like, you know, okay, your lungs do the breathing, you know, but that's not all. There's a circulatory system, so there are other functions. And there's a very interesting story. I didn't have a chance to find it again, but Ajahn Brahm, in a talk some years ago, talked about the strange case of the man without a brain. Have you ever heard him talk about that? And I Googled it and I found it, and actually it's true. So there was a student in the UK at a university, and I think the neurology department were doing some studies, and they asked volunteers to come in and they scanned their brains. And when they had the first scan, they thought there was a mistake, so they asked the student to come back. And I think he was a graduate student, so he wasn't like I think he might have been doing a degree in maths. So I can't remember exactly, because this is some years ago that I looked it up. But he had a partner, etc. So he was leading a normal life, right? So they asked this guy, they thought, oh, this can't be right. He came back in, they scanned him again, and they said, you've got no brain. I think he had the brain stem, but the rest of his skull was filled with fluid. He really had like just a little bit of brain, but the normal kind of brains that the rest of us have, or we hope. I mean, who knows? Now you might get paranoid, right? You might think, oh my God, I might not have a brain. All this time I've lived my whole life without a brain. And so they did tests on him and everything. He really didn't have a brain, but he was living a normal life. He wasn't. And admittedly, the study said that most people, there are humans that are born with this condition, and it causes a severe physical, mental, and physical retardation, right? That they have a lot of trouble living, basically. But this gentleman was leading a perfectly normal life. And Ajahn Brahm points to this, and I think this is a good point, is that the mind is there. It found a way. His mind found a way of compensating for this physical abnormality and created a brain somehow. All his normal functions were there, I guess all the things of his left brain and right brain were still happening. So this is the problem with kind of neurology, is that we're coming, and this is my issue with it, is that we're coming from the idea of looking at anatomy and determining that, okay, this is, the brain is determining these things. I suspect, in my view, that the mind finds a way, uses the anatomy to do these things, but the mind is the mind, right? The mind has these qualities, and this is where we probably come back to Buddhism, is that it's the mind that has a tendency to vipallasa, to distortion. Yep. Yeah. 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 Correct, yeah. I prefer heart myself, actually. I find heart kind of feels more spiritual to me, and it feels more connected. And, I mean, if any of you have ever had a broken heart for one reason or other, it's very present in this part of your chest, right? Perhaps at the death of somebody, or the sickness or anxiety. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And his wife said that there were two people that he never associated.
Right.
And after the operation, was quite okay with that group of people.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, and recently there was could be a story on Netflix.
Yeah.
The heart remembers.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I suspect that we're all a little bit different, right? But that as individuals, we have these underlying tendencies that are karmic, that we have created ourselves, and that our hearts are very important. I think our mind is certainly there in our heart as well. So these things he doesn't really go into too much, because he's kind of stuck in the brain. And these are probably would be my criticisms, but it's still a very interesting book. He's also comes from a Zen background, so it's always interesting to me that the Zen people I have met in my life, they don't tend to study early Buddhist teachings or the suttas, and so there's this gap in understanding of how the Buddha talked very, very clearly about the sense bases, contact, the mind, the aggregates, and his effort, because in a sense this book is deconstructing, right? And deconstructionism is very important in Buddhism, certainly in the early Buddhist texts, because we see the Buddha breaking us down into elements, aggregates, and allowing us to then look at the processes, but seeing that. And he's not so interested in the body. The Buddha is guiding us to the mind. And he's not trying to, maybe that's why he left the brain out. Maybe he didn't want us to get obsessed with a physical representation of the mind. He wanted us perhaps to look at the heart or the mind in its non-physical manifestation. Because this is another thing, the book doesn't really talk about underlying tendencies, or certainly not rebirth. I think that in America, probably for the audience, those things would be quite challenging. But within Buddhism, we know that rebirth, the creation of ourselves, the tendencies we have, our karma, all those things are fundamental, right? And our mind is created from those things, or it sustains those things. And so he doesn't go very deeply into those things. And then you could say, well, okay, where do the underlying tendencies fit? If you have a left brain and that's just kind of doing these things, where do those tendencies come from? So that kind of starts to break down a little bit if you look at the kind of more deeper and profound teachings of Buddhism, where you understand actually the mind is creating all of this out of the body does what the mind has made it. And who knows, maybe if your left brain stops to function so well, it might move a bit to the right? These might be standard things, but they may not apply to everybody. And as the man with no brain showed, that you could still have those kind of characteristics even without having a left brain and a right brain. Yes, when they were doing the tests of the split brain people, they were feeding them information through the eyes and on cards, etc. And so they were basically saying, yes, the left brain is connected to the right eye, and the right brain is connected to the left eye. And so through those senses, then information is coming through into the brains, and then the brains are processing. It's a very mechanistic kind of process. But I think, again, what I would say is that okay, these processes are happening. There's contact, as the Buddha says, there's eye, visual object. But he says there's eye consciousness, which is a specific type of eye consciousness, right? A consciousness which is actually separate. Our tongue consciousness can't really talk to our eye consciousness. And our tongue doesn't understand what our eye understands, and vice versa. And the Buddha makes that distinction. He kind of says, actually, the consciousnesses, we have 6, and they're very distinct. They do their own thing, right? They have a way of understanding and making meaning that he would say is probably right brain understanding, right? It's not something that we can really describe. And I think, they have tried to figure out how the tongue, they thought, it must have physical receptors. That's how it tastes things. But actually, they haven't found those, right? So there's a sense that these things are actually quantum functionality. They're not happening on a physical, chemical level as such. There's something happening with our tongue and the kind of miracle of taste, which is just so normal for us, how we can distinguish between all these different tastes, bitter, sour, all these things, how it's immediate and how the consciousness is there, right? And in the eye, the way that consciousness also makes sense of something. But the left brain, he says, is where all that kind of proliferation happens, the interpretation, the creation of patterns happens. So it seems like there are layers. If you put those two ways of thinking about it together, there are layers and layers. And he's probably going through the more surface layers of things. Of course, in our practice and our teachings in Buddhism, we're trying to go very deep into things. So to go back to what are the causes, what are the underlying tendencies, how do these things arise? And of course, the Buddha is how do we escape some of the suffering? So he does talk about, okay, if the left brain is, pardon? He says the left brain is probably where the fiction or the falsehood of the self arises, right? And he says it's because you have your own experience. We experience the world on our own. He talks a little about maybe there's a collective consciousness. I'm not sure about that, but that your mind goes off into the collective and then comes back in the morning when it's when it wake up, etc. I wasn't sold on that idea. It's here, right? This fathom-long body, this being is where your understanding, where the world is. This is the world, the Buddha says. Eddie.
Yeah, I'm trying to analyze
Mm-hmm.
what tells us of book
Yeah.
about the left mind,
Yeah. Left brain.
brain,
Yes.
right brain.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So from what and how to link this with what the Buddha tells us.
Yes. Yeah.
So from my understanding from you explained from the book,
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the right one is the one looking inside. The Buddha asks us to look
Inside, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Buddha is the problem.
Yeah.
I think it's permanent suffering. It's not permanent.
Yeah.
There's not suffer, there's a suffering.
Yeah, that's what he was saying actually, that your left side is constantly creating an idea of self. It's interpreting everything through the lens of self, and then it's telling you, okay, this is what I think, this is how I am, and it's also it's creating a sense of identity, and the suffering also arises because the sense of identity that we're creating is not true, right? It's a fiction, and so when we measure it against our experiences, it's always falls short. I thought that was quite nice. It's always not. So we're kind of thinking, this is what I am, and this is what I want to be, or where I want to be, or etc. And they never really match up, is what he's saying. This kind of thing. It's an impossible game. Actually, it's an impossibility to because he's saying it's not, none of it is really true, right? And so we're caught up in this process. But he said when they've just tested normal people, the more your self is threatened, the more your left brain kicks in and tries to create other ideas. It says, oh, okay, well, if somebody just told me that I'm really stupid, they must be foolish, or that's not possible, or they're wrong, there's something wrong with them, right? So I've experienced those things where you discount things which may be true. Maybe I am stupid, maybe I'm not very clever at something. But your left brain actually starts kind of going through a cycle where it tells you, no, that's not true, right? It doesn't believe that, and it starts creating an answer. I talked about the incorrect or the fantasy answers about. It might say, well, no, I'm smart because I did this, I've done that. Right? To understand virtuous conduct, to understand that actually we can experience samadhi, and to understand and to actually directly experience the wisdom of the understanding of the three characteristics: non-self, impermanence, and suffering. Understand that that's the nature of this process that we're going through. And I suppose that's kind of the meaning that we have as Buddhists. He also kind of says that study after study shows that the complaining mind actually causes a lot of suffering for us, right? And the left brain is the mind which complains, finds fault, distinguishes between different things, looking at patterns and why things don't fit, what's outside, what's inside. It's doing all its grouping. And he talks about, that the opening up to the right brain and letting that gratitude and contentment arise is psychologically and in terms of the brain functionality something that's really positive, right? And how damaging, I thought that was quite interesting, how damaging a complaining mind is, a fault-finding mind is, and how that can lead to depression. So yeah, yes, Takeshi. Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It can be negative. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Analytical. He does point out that actually the right brain is the seat of emotions, so it can have fear, anxiety, etc. And as I said, he doesn't really talk about what I would say is, from my practice and from reading the sutras, the underlying tendencies, right? Why are we so unique, and we have these underlying tendencies that make us head towards more negative emotions or more complaining or fault-finding. Yeah. Right. to kind of balance each other out. And maybe that he does point out that probably what you need to do is a middle path rather than being dominated by left or right. Have something that balances both out, because of course, as you're pointing at quite right, Takeshi, that the right brain can also be problematic when you have intuitions or gut instincts that you're gambling and you think, no, I'm putting everything on red again, all right? And he says, no, it doesn't really work that way. Just because the roulette table has hit red the last 5 times doesn't mean it's going to be, black the next time, right? Because it's statistically, that's not how things work in random things, but you will have that sense and you'll suffer because of it, and these things happen to humans as well. Yes, quite right. So he does say that probably that maybe as we develop our meditation process, because the mind is using both, right? For example, he talks about the left brain sequential analysis, and I was thinking about dependent origination, specifically about that, which is a sequence of 12 conditionalities, and it's very sequential, and that analytical nature of the Buddha's mind is also there. So we need both sides. We need that kind of intuitive meaning-making understanding, but also the ability to take that. And you read suttas where after his enlightenment, the Buddha is sitting there and he's analyzing, right? He talks about where he would just sit there for days, actually the 7 days after, going through that experience and understanding it, possibly putting it into words, right, in his mind, so that he can explain it to himself. So I've experienced this, and now I can actually explain that to myself with language.
I'm just thinking of, like, if you do a long retreat,
Yes.
could it be that after many days you're quite in your left side?
Yes, yeah.
Left, and then the awareness comes onto the right brain, and with the loving kindness meditation, you balance both.
Yes. I think so. I think that's right. I think there's a balancing of both, because sometimes, and particularly perhaps in insight meditation, so, in our tradition we say that you can't really do insight meditation. Well, insights arise actually, in your meditation anyway. When your mind is very peaceful, there's something will arise and an understanding will just pop up, right? But you can also direct your mind, when your mind becomes peaceful, towards the recollection of certain types of Dhamma, certain teachings of the impermanence of, the classic one is that of the nature to become sick, of not gone beyond sickness, of aging, of death, etc. And so this is a recollection that the Buddha recommended we do every day, and that your karma, you are the owner and inheritor of your karma, right? So clearly the Buddha is also saying at times when our mind is perhaps, if you're lucky enough or not lucky enough, if you're skilled enough to be able to go into jhana, you have that skill and you come out, traditionally we say that is the time to turn your attention and recollect these or examine these things. And this power of your mind allows deeper insights, right, to arise, which I think is part of that process that you were talking about.
Because the interview we had,
Mm-hmm.
he, at the back of his body, there is this, you do not exist to serve the illusion.
Yeah.
The illusion exists to serve you.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, he talks a bit about the left brain giving you the idea it's the master, it's the pilot, it's the one that's in control, it's the one that's doing, right? Because it's chattering away all the time, it doesn't stop. And it could be Mara. And so, but actually you become the slave to the left brain, is what he says. Is the tendency is that you sort of, you're jumping around doing what it tells you, believing what it tells you about the world, about things, and yet a lot of it, as he's shown through, is not correct. It's not really true, right? It's distorted view of reality. So we've got to 5:39. Are there any other questions or comments that? Yes. Yes. Right, right. Yeah. I think that could be true. You know, I think he was specifically talking about us being the 7 billion humans on Earth having a sort of a collective consciousness, and that we sort of are only when we are awake that we are we distinguish ourselves and become individuals, kind of thing, which is why I kind of thought, oh, maybe. But I know that in the dream state, I mean, your mind moves, right? He talks a bit about clairvoyance as well, and this relates to the morphic field of consciousness. So he said that his view about the ability to hear and see at a distance, which is of the Buddha and a number of arahants had that quality, those capabilities, and he said that means that your mind expands way beyond the physicality of your body, right? It can go vast distance, and so in the suttas we see the arahants with these supernormal powers being able to visit effectively other dimensions, the Deva realms, a variety of them, all the way up to the Dhammalokas, and to move through solid things, objects, to walk on water, to solidify water, to make many of themselves when they're instead of one and come back to one, to fly through the air. So it seems like their mind had gone beyond the limitations of physicality to do that thing. And I personally believe it. You know, I know some monastics or some people, some Buddhists don't tend to, but it's stated so often in the suttas, and so in such a matter-of-fact way. But not everybody could. I think there's one sutta, I can't remember which one, where out of 500 arahants, only 60 had these abilities, right? So even, it was, that's a 12%. So it's only a small number. If you can take that as a scientific sample, it's showing you that a small sample of these arahants who were fully enlightened, all in the same way, but they had these additional abilities, right, of retrocognition, so to see your past lives, to cut through that. So your mind goes way beyond the boundaries. So so I think actually for the rest of us, yes, I believe our consciousness can travel and connect. Yes, yeah. Yeah, so it was a very specific thing, and I kind of thought about it like, you just disappear and then you kind of come back. But the thing is, when you're dreaming, you generally have a very strong sense of identity, I find anyway, right? You're still busy doing things, and it's still you, but all the normal rules of the physics no longer apply. And that's actually one of the interesting things of dream yoga. If any of you are interested in it, I've not been very successful with it. Dream yoga, I've read books on it, but the idea of dream yoga is to sort of understand that the laws of physics don't apply in your dreams, right? And also that you can have virtue and morality in your dreams as well. I think the latter is probably more important, that you can make virtuous, ethical decisions in your dreams. Like, if you're scared and you feel threatened, you can still say, no, I'm not going to hurt that person, right? I'm going to be kind, etc. And those are amazing things. But dream yoga is, I think, one thing I was reading, I think in the Tibetan tradition, they're talking about, okay, the first thing you have to do is you have to realize that you're dreaming, that you're asleep and dreaming. So that's like you're sort of awake and you're dreaming at the same time, right? So once you understand that you are aware, you're aware that you're in a dream state, then you can start to do things, right? So then you can command yourself. You're not just responding to what's happening. So your consciousness becomes a bit more controlling. The next step is to actually walk through a solid object, is to actually... They said then later you can graduate. If you can start doing that, you can jump off buildings or cliffs or whatever and fly, right? And so it's very intriguing. And I believe that, the Tibetans who practice this can do this, so it makes complete sense to me that it would be something that you can do. But they're trying to say that basically you're starting to manage your mind. be more in control of it, and therefore you can actually enjoy your dream states because you're ethical in them. You're not afraid. You can actually enjoy them. You can have fun, like you can fly and walk through walls and stuff like that, which are potentially things that arahants can do, right? Okay. Anything else?
Can we say the left brain and the right brain, one is negative and one is positive?
Well, it comes across that way in the book, partly because the left brain is the one that causes seems to be creating your sense of self and causing you suffering. So in that sense, yes. But as Takeshi was also pointing out, the right brain is also where we have our emotional seat, and you can also be where anxiety arises, obsessions and things like that. So I think it's not quite right that there, but I think what he's pointing out is that, particularly in the West, that we listen to our left brain a lot, and we're not very in much connection with our right brain. He says our right brain is telling us stuff all the time, but we tend to disregard it because it's not talking to us, right? It's messaging us by perhaps intuition or creativity, in other ways, emotion, but because especially in this day and age, the Earth's population is now the most educated it's been, right? Many of us will go through 10, 15 years, 20 years sometimes of education, like standardized, processed education. So our left brain is thinking so much through that. And so, we become specialized, we do jobs, etc. We have to do all this stuff. So we're highly skilled in many ways, but also we're probably dominated a lot by our left brain. And so I guess what he's saying is connecting through things like yoga and meditation are very important ways of actually finding that balance.
Music as well?
Music, yes, yeah, music especially. Looking at nature, things that create beauty and a sense of, wonder in your heart, etc. Yeah.
Being mindful of time.
Yeah. Right.
Saying that it's not necessary that there is no self, but it's more a strategy.
Right.
Sort of like not clinging too much, because the self does have a function as well.
Yes, yeah.
There might be no independent self or no
Yeah.
self that exists apart from everything else.
Yeah.
There might be some kind of independent.
Yes, it's a bit like the conventional self, like conventional language in the suttas, and then there's sort of a ultimate, that's more common.
We're actually saying anyway that there is no self.
Yes. Yes. He says that in the three characteristics, there's no self. And so he said, and the Buddha's teaching on no self is that don't worry. When you experience no self, and when you become an arahant, or when you attain to nibbana, there is no problem. And this kind of no self, no problem. Actually, I was reading in one of Ajahn Chah's books, I can't remember, I sort of lost it again, but he actually exactly says that, no self, no problem. And he said, when you continue to function, but there are no problems in the world. Of course, things happen. You will get sick. You will die. Events happen that may not be convenient, but there are no problems because you don't have a sense that this is happening to me, right? These are this normal things that happen, and there's nothing wrong with that. And what I get from the suttas is that the Buddha is telling us, no, there's no problem when you completely have no self, right? You still continue to function. He realized the Buddha had no self, right? But he could still explain dependent origination. He could still compose poetry off the cuff, like beautiful, the Sutta Nipata, etc. Some of the most beautiful, wonderful poetry in the world, in the history of humanity, comes from the Buddha. He speaks in verse, and he explains the whole path to you in verse. And one of my favorite verses, which maybe I'll end with that, is from the Sutta Nipata. And the wonderful thing that the Buddha does is he explains to you delusion and the path and nibbana in like several lines, right? So he says, see this world, observe this world with its devas, conceiving a self in what is non-self. Settled upon name and form, they conceive this is true. But however they conceive it, it becomes otherwise, and there indeed is its falsity, because the transient is of a false nature. Nibbana is of a non-false nature. This the noble ones know as truth. Through the breakthrough to truth, they are hungerless and fully quenched. That's it. And that's a bit of Buddha's poetry for you. Thank you. Yes. Yes, I think so. I mean, there is Dharma in this book as well, right? I think there's, as Ajahn Chah says, there's Dharma in everything if you look for it. So, but I think it's a little bit dangerous to kind of get too committed to understanding everything through anatomy and through this process. But this book is not really written for Buddhists as such. It's trying to help an average everyday person in the West, particularly in North America, come to terms with the idea, which would be very shocking for them, that there is no such thing as a self, right? And so he's using scientific terms, language, and proof and studies to try and show them, and some worked examples to try and give them a sense of idea, because he does say that the limitation, or as Thanissaro Bhikkhu says, is as you reduce this kind of involvement with the sense of self, your suffering also reduces. Thank you. Maybe pay respects to the Buddha.